It's not relevant to me because I'm not a download artist. Download is a very, very small percentage of what the people that want my product. It's a very small percentage, so I'm not a download act.
He's the rock icon who hates fame, once denied fathering a child in a public scandal, and managed to feud with both record labels and his neighbors. Van Morrison's life is packed with strange twists, private battles, and poetic rebellion most fans never hear about. Here's a quiz question for you. What bizarre stunt did Morrison pull to escape a brutal recording contract in the 1960s? Drop your guess in the comments. We'll reveal it later in the video. Stay tuned for his secret helicopter commutes, a $1 million deal that changed everything, and how he's still performing on his own terms. But before we get into all that, we need to go back, because Van Morrison's early life holds a few pivotal moments that shaped everything that followed. The Lonely Genius on Hendford Street. East Belfast, 1945. The war was just ending, but for George Ivan Morrison, known simply as Van, the real noise was only beginning. Born on Hendford Street into a working-class Protestant family, he arrived in a world divided by religion, rebuilding from rubble. Yet inside his modest, terraced home, another universe was spinning, one of blues, jazz, and gospel, piped in through an enormous record collection his father had amassed during a stint in Detroit. Before most kids learned to tie their shoes, Van was memorizing Lead Belly and Mahalia Jackson. By 11, he had a guitar in his hands and chords from an old Carter family songbook under his fingers. At 12, he formed a skiffle band called the Sputniks, named after the Soviet satellite. While other boys played football, Van was arranging songs and performing at local cinema halls. The neighborhood was militantly Protestant, but the Morrison home was anything but conventional. His mother, Violet, once a tap dancer and singer, dabbled in religious groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses. His father, on the other hand, was an avowed atheist. Van, the only child caught between them, often wandered inward. According to his mother, he would say he wasn't sure if he'd been blessed or cursed because the music never stopped running through his head. Peers were few. Teachers called him aloof. But behind that stillness was a boy who would sneak off to jazz clubs and beg for saxophone lessons from George Cassidy, a local musician who became an early mentor. Cassidy's influence, like the rhythms of East Belfast itself, never left him. Still, by 17, Van had already hit his first crucible, an intense European tour with a show band that pushed him to the edge, gritty, unglamorous, and utterly transformative. The rise of a star who went on strike. By 1964, Van Morrison had swapped Belfast's smoky clubs for London's recording studios, fronting the garage rock band Them. His voice, raw, defiant, soaked in soul, drove hits like Gloria and Here Comes the Night. But even as success mounted, the industry's grip tightened. Van had always bristled against control, and in Them, he found himself boxed in, playing to commercial expectations he had no interest in meeting it, so he left. Alone and unsigned, he landed in New York and recorded Brown-Eyed Girl in 1967. It would become a timeless anthem, but for Van, it was a hollow victory. The album was released without his consent, and he saw barely a penny. "I was broke and depressed," he later said. "I had no money, no direction." This frustration echoed the same feeling he'd had as a boy in Belfast, hemmed in, misunderstood, desperate to do things his way. And then came the bizarre twist. Trapped in a harsh recording contract after the sudden death of label head Bert Burns, Van was told he could walk free if he delivered 36 new songs in a year. So he did, but ringworms, sandwiches, and nonsensical rambles, intentionally unlistenable. The label shelved them. Van was free. It was rebellious, ridiculous, and brilliant. From that creative vengeance rose Astral Weeks in 1968, recorded while Van was literally starving. A swirling spiritual odyssey, it was unlike anything else of its time. Critics hailed it as genius. Audiences were baffled. He didn't care. That album, born in hardship, carved the path for his truest self. Then came Moondance, Into the Mystic, and a career defined not by hits, but by mood, meaning, and mastery. His success wasn't formulaic. It was hard-won, spiritual, and often lonely. Yet beyond the charts and controversies, it was the life he built, off-stage, off-camera, that revealed the most about Van Morrison. Buckle up as we dive into the lifestyle insights. The Mystic on Hindford Street. Even as the hits piled up, Van Morrison never surrendered to the chaos of celebrity life. Instead, he retreated inward into music, memory, and mysticism. This was no affectation. As mentioned earlier, his mystical sensibility was already alive at 12 during a fishing trip where he drank from a stranger's stream and claimed time stood still. He later described the moment as being stoned by nature, a kind of spiritual jolt that would echo through his work for decades. Songs like Into the Mystic and In the Garden aren't just lyrics, they're maps of inner space. Van often spoke about hearing the music of gulls and the sound of silence on water, citing nature as his greatest teacher. While his peers chased tours and headlines, Van was more likely to be found on a solitary walk through the Irish countryside, notebook in pocket, listening to the wind. The poet who hates pop culture. Morrison's war with celebrity has been as consistent as his discography. Being famous is not great for the creative process, he once said, and he's lived by that sentiment religiously. He famously declined interviews with Top of the Pops, refused to play greatest hits on demand, and often altered lyrics mid-performance just to stay present in the moment. He even found poetry in the mundane. One late interview revealed that he listened to British shipping forecasts as though they were lyrical compositions, weather updates transformed into rhythm and cadence. It's an odd, endearing detail that underscores his lifelong commitment to finding the sacred in the overlooked. The Gentleman Hermit. For all his brooding stage presence, those who've spent time with Van in private paint a very different picture. As noted in earlier interviews, he's been described as courteous, engaged, and even playful, ordering a simple coffee, cracking dry jokes backstage. One journalist called him oddly straightforward, a man with no image to uphold and no patience for games. He dresses plainly, often in tailored suits and a trusty fedora, and lives even more simply. No entourages, no flashy appearances, just a quiet daily discipline focused on writing, walking, reading, and the occasional jazz record. A man at ease in his solitude. Frugal, fierce, and free. Van Morrison has always been financially savvy, but not in the traditional sense. Rather than chasing wealth, he pursued independence. As touched on earlier, he once bought and renovated his own recording studio, the Wool Hall, just to record on his own terms. He also launched Orangefield Records, named after his childhood street, to bypass traditional labels and release archive material directly to fans. Even his 2015 deal with Sony, which handed over rights to 33 of his albums, was viewed as a pragmatic move. Less a cash grab, more a long-term strategy to ensure his legacy reached the streaming generation. Behind every financial decision was the same theme: sovereignty over art. And when the world shut down during COVID-19, Van stirred controversy by releasing songs that criticized lockdowns. This led to public backlash and even a defamation lawsuit from Northern Ireland's health minister. But it also revealed something else: Van's relentless need to speak his mind, no matter the cost. Generous in the shadows. What few know is that Morrison has long supported others behind the scenes. He funded blues scholarships at Belfast's Maritime Hotel, quietly gave performance bonuses to longtime band members, and during the pandemic set up a financial hardship fund for struggling musicians. These efforts rarely make headlines because that's how he wants it. Quiet care, never performed. Morrison's lifestyle isn't about luxury, it's about intention. Whether he's listening to radio static as if it were Miles Davis or walking through the woods to find the right phrase, he stayed rooted in the same rhythm he discovered as a lonely boy on Hindford Street. Still, while the public may only see the solitude, the story behind the man involves complex entanglements, muses, scandals, heartbreak, and lifelong bonds that shape the emotional terrain of his music. The women behind the curtain. For a man who built a life on solitude, Van Morrison's personal connections have been anything but uneventful. His first great love was Janet Planet Rigsby, a California muse who inspired songs like Tupelo Honey and graced the cover of the album by the same name. They married in 1968, partly to help him avoid deportation, and had a daughter, Shauna, who later joined him on stage and in the studio. But like many of Van's best songs, the marriage was beautiful, brief, and tinged with ache. It ended in 1973. Decades later, his second marriage, this time to Dublin socialite and former Miss Ireland Michelle Rocca, lasted far longer but was no less turbulent. Their relationship, often shielded from the press, unraveled over the years. The divorce, finalized in 2018, was described by Van as hugely wearying. He wasn't one for melodrama, he just wanted it done. And then came the scandal that few expected. In 2009, a public post on his official website announced the birth of a son with his tour manager, Gigi Lee. Van denied it outright, claiming the site had been hacked. The child tragically died in infancy, followed shortly by Lee's death from cancer. Morrison never spoke publicly about the ordeal again, but amid the heartbreak were bonds that endured. His daughter Shayna remains a close collaborator, and fellow musicians like Brian Kennedy and Bap Kennedy credit Van as a generous mentor. Even blues legends like John Lee Hooker joined him on stage in later years. Idols turned friends in a full-circle kind of grace. Nonetheless, behind these entanglements was always a man quietly building something else. Not just relationships, but an empire. And that story wasn't told through interviews or headlines. It was told through the numbers. The earnings of a man who never sold out. Van Morrison's financial journey mirrors his expansive and enduring musical career. As of 2025, his net worth is estimated at $90 million, accumulated through decades of songwriting, performances, and savvy business ventures. A significant portion of his wealth stems from his extensive discography, including timeless hits like Brown-Eyed Girl, which continues to generate substantial royalties. His prolific output of over 40 studio albums has ensured a steady income stream bolstered by consistent touring and live performances. Notably, his company, Exile Productions Limited, reported accumulated profits of €8.85 million, reflecting the commercial success of his musical endeavors. However, Morrison's financial path hasn't been without its challenges. Early in his solo career, he faced contractual disputes that led to creative tensions and impacted his earnings. Despite these hurdles, his resilience and dedication to his craft have solidified his status as one of the wealthiest musicians from Northern Ireland. Yet, beyond the numbers, it's Morrison's investments in tangible assets that offer a glimpse into his lifestyle and personal tastes. The spaces he escaped into. Van Morrison's homes have never just been addresses, they've been sanctuaries, battlegrounds, and quiet stages for an artist who's spent a lifetime dodging the spotlight. He was born at 125 Hinford Street in East Belfast, a modest, terraced house that's now a pilgrimage site for fans. That same street would later lend its name to a reflective song and, decades on, his very own record label, Orangefield Records. In the late 1960s, Van settled in Woodstock, New York with Janet Planet Rigsby. The creative energy of that era and place bled into Moondance, written and recorded in the stillness of the surrounding countryside. Later, he moved to Mill Valley, California, where the misty hills inspired the earthy spirituality of St. Dominic's Preview. Back across the Atlantic, Morrison purchased the Wool Hall in Somerset, England in 1994, a 16th-century building converted into a recording studio. This wasn't just a creative retreat, it was a fortress of autonomy. He renamed it, recorded several albums there, and even stored his master tapes on site before eventually selling the property in 2002. But perhaps most telling are his long-standing ties to Dalkey, a wealthy enclave in Dublin. There he lived next to Formula One driver Eddie Irvine and found himself embroiled in legal battles over balconies and driveways. A quiet man suddenly dragged into very public disputes. Yet even the homes that stirred lawsuits say something revealing. Van Morrison values privacy like currency, and he's willing to fight for it. Still, his desire to stay hidden didn't stop at brick and mortar. Sometimes it took to the skies. The vehicles that took him off the grid. Van Morrison has never been known for flaunting a flashy garage, and when it comes to cars, his most famous mention might actually be fictional. In 1967, he released a quirky little track called "Who Drove the Red Sports Car?" Whether or not he ever owned one remains unclear, but the imagery, like so much in Van's work, felt more symbolic than literal. A red sports car, after all, could have represented the kind of spotlight he spent decades avoiding. As for motorbikes, there's no public record of Van roaring down country lanes on two wheels, leather jacket flapping in the wind. It wouldn't quite suit him anyway. His version of escape was quieter, more concealed. And when it came to long-distance travel, Van didn't choose the typical tour bus or commercial jet. He chose to rise above it all, literally. Reports from the early 2010s revealed that Van Morrison used a top-tier private helicopter estimated at 10.5 million euros to travel discreetly between his homes in Belfast and Killiney. It was more than a luxury, it was a strategy. It let him avoid traffic, cameras, and casual encounters. Some even claimed he used disguises while boarding just to maintain that sacred bubble of privacy. Yachts? There's no confirmed record of ownership, but he did perform at Hollywood Yacht Club in Belfast in 2016. Even then, he slipped in and out quietly, leaving only the music behind. Jets, yachts, and even metaphoric sports cars. Van has always preferred transport that keeps him one step removed from the chaos of fame. Yet even with all that effort to stay airborne and unseen, Van Morrison never stopped creating and never stopped showing up when it truly mattered. The final act still being written. As of 2025, Van Morrison is still writing, still recording, and, true to form, still doing it all on his own terms. His upcoming album, Remembering Now, due for release on June 13th, blends soul, jazz, folk, blues, and country into a reflective tapestry of memory and meaning. It's not just a record, it's a kind of reckoning. The lead single, Down to Joy, first heard in Kenneth Branagh's Belfast, feels like a homecoming. Fitting for a man who never really left the city in his heart. He's also announced new live dates, including a performance at Belfast's Waterfront Hall, proof that even after decades of grappling with stage fright, the pull of the music still wins. In interviews, he's compared singing to breathing, calling it essential, not just professionally, but spiritually. Now nearing 80, Van remains a complex figure, fiercely private yet endlessly expressive. He's hinted at releasing a treasure trove of unreleased recordings, vaulted tapes from the 70s through the 90s. Not for nostalgia's sake, but because, as he's always said, the music speaks louder than any headline. And maybe, in the end, that's the final twist. For a man who's spent a lifetime hiding in plain sight, Van Morrison's legacy was never built on being seen. It was built on being heard. What surprised you most about Van Morrison's life? Let us know in the comments. Hit like, subscribe for more, and check out the next video on screen now. You won't want to miss it.